It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, me, my buddy Dave, and the endless wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. We'd been planning it for months, eager to escape the city noise, breathe in fresh mountain air, and lose ourselves in nature. It was meant to be peaceful, maybe even rejuvenating. But instead, we got lost in something far darker. We set off on a Saturday morning, early enough to avoid the crowds that sometimes plagued the more popular trails. Dave had picked a route that was a little off the beaten path. Less tourists, more nature, he had said, grinning like a kid. The drive up the mountain was beautiful, and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. We parked the car at the trailhead, grabbed our gear, and set off, eager for adventure. The first few hours were exactly what I had hoped for. Tall trees loomed above us, their leaves filtering the sunlight into golden beams. Birds sang overhead, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. We hiked steadily, following the path as it wound deeper into the forest. By mid-afternoon, we found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing with a view of the mountains in the distance. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, we built a fire and settled in for the evening, swapping stories and laughing about work, life, and everything in between. There was something calming about being so far from civilization, surrounded by nothing but nature. I felt at peace. But that night, as we sat around the crackling fire, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a sudden stillness in the air. The birds stopped singing, and the usual rustle of forest life disappeared, leaving only the faint sound of the fire and our own voices. Dave noticed it too, his laughter fading into a frown. He glanced around, squinting into the darkness. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I replied, though I already felt it too. Or rather, the absence of sound. The forest was too quiet. We both listened, but there was nothing, no wind, no insects, no movement. Just silence. "I don't like this," Dave muttered, standing up and pacing around the fire. "Something's not right." I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the stillness was just a trick of the night. But the uneasy feeling crept over me, growing stronger with each passing minute. There was something about the way the darkness pressed in around us, as if the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As the night deepened, we crawled into our tents, trying to shake off the strange vibe. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, my ears straining for any sign of normalcy, a breeze, a distant animal call, anything. Instead, I heard something else. A soft whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct, too human. It was low, almost unintelligible, but there was no mistaking the sound of a voice. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dave?" I called out softly. "You awake?" No answer. I could hear him snoring softly in the tent next to mine, completely oblivious. The whispering continued, growing louder. It seemed to be coming from the woods, just beyond the ring of firelight. I unzipped my tent cautiously, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had died down, casting long shadows across the clearing. The darkness beyond the trees was thick, impenetrable. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was tall, its form barely visible in the gloom, but I could see the outline of a person, a man, or at least something shaped like one. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. the whispering stopped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I took a step forward, squinting to make out more detail, but the figure remained obscured by shadows. Something about it felt wrong, deeply wrong, as if it didn't belong to this world. "Dave," I hissed, backing away toward his tent. "Wake up, man." Dave stirred, groaning as he crawled out of his tent. "What's going on?" he mumbled sleepily. I pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "There's someone out there." Dave squinted, following my gaze. "I don't see anything." I turned back toward the figure, but it was gone. The space where it had stood was empty, the darkness silent once more. "You sure you weren't just dreaming?" Dave asked, still half asleep. I shook my head. "I'm telling you, there was someone out there." Dave sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Look, we're in the middle of the woods. It's probably just your mind playing tricks. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat by the fire for the rest of the night, watching the shadows, waiting for the figure to return. But it never did. The next day, we packed up camp and continued hiking deeper into the woods. I tried to put the previous night out of my mind, convincing myself that it was just a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But the further we went, the more unsettling the forest became. By late afternoon, we had strayed off the main trail, following what we thought was a shortcut. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the sun. The path was narrow, barely visible beneath the underbrush, and the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. "Are we even going the right way?" I asked, my voice tight with unease. Dave pulled out the map, frowning. "I think so. It should loop back around to the main trail soon." But it didn't. The deeper we went, the more the landscape began to change. The trees took on a strange, almost twisted shape, their bark gnarled and knotted like the faces of ancient, withered creatures. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. And then, we found it. An old, decrepit cabin, hidden deep within the woods. It looked abandoned, the windows shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. Vines crawled up the walls, and the roof had partially caved in. "Who the hell builds a cabin all the way out here?" Dave muttered, staring at the structure in disbelief. "I don't think we should go near it," I said, feeling a chill creep up my spine. But Dave, ever the curious one, ignored my warning and approached the cabin. "Come on, it's probably just some old hunting lodge or something. Let's check it out." Reluctantly, I followed him, my eyes darting nervously around the clearing. As we approached the cabin, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize. They were crude, almost primitive, and something about them made my skin crawl. Dave pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly in the stillness of the forest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Broken furniture littered the floor, and a musty smell hung in the air. "This place is creepy as hell," I muttered, stepping cautiously inside. Dave wandered around, inspecting the old fireplace and the crumbling walls. "Man, this place is ancient. Wonder who used to live here." I didn't answer. My attention was drawn to a corner of the room, where something caught my eye, an old photograph, half buried beneath debris. I picked it up, wiping away the dust. The photo was of a group of people standing in front of the cabin. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces stern and unsmiling. But it wasn't the people in the photo that unsettled me, it was what stood behind them. There, in the shadows of the trees, was the same figure I had seen the night before. Tall, featureless, watching. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." Dave turned to look at me, confused. "What's wrong?" I held up the photo, showing him the figure. His face went pale. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." We left the cabin in a hurry, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with every step. As we made our way back through the woods, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed darker than before. The trees loomed above us, their twisted branches reaching down like claws. And then we heard it. A low, guttural whisper echoing through the trees. It was the same whisper I had heard the night before, but now it was closer, louder. It surrounded us, coming from every direction. "Run," Dave whispered, his eyes wide with fear. We took off, sprinting through the forest, the whispering growing louder with every step. The trees blurred around us, and the path disappeared beneath our feet. I could feel something behind me, chasing us, getting closer. I didn't dare look back. We ran for what felt like hours, the forest twisting and turning around us like a labyrinth. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear drove me forward. I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, urging me to stop, to give up. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The air grew still, the forest silent once more. We slowed to a stop, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The forest around us was unfamiliar, the trees thicker, the shadows darker. "We're lost," Dave whispered, his voice hollow. I didn't respond. I knew he was right. And somewhere, in the darkness, I knew it was still watching us. Waiting. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the whispers had been. My heart was pounding in my ears, and every breath I took felt like it might be my last. Dave leaned against a tree, his face pale and slick with sweat, his chest heaving. "How the hell did we get here?" he muttered, eyes scanning the dense, unfamiliar forest around us. "We can't have gone that far off the trail." I didn't answer him because deep down, I knew we hadn't just gotten lost. Something else had taken us off the path. The forest wasn't normal, wasn't playing by the rules of nature. The trees seemed thicker now, twisted and dark, looming over us like they were closing in. The sun, which had been high in the sky when we first started running, was now barely visible behind the heavy canopy, casting everything in a strange, twilight gloom. "We need to keep moving," I finally said, though my voice was hoarse and unsteady. "Standing around won't help." Dave nodded reluctantly, pushing himself off the tree. But neither of us moved for a moment. We were too afraid. The oppressive stillness of the forest seemed to wrap around us, suffocating. It was like the whole place was alive, watching us, waiting for something. And there was still the sensation, faint but unmistakable, that we weren't alone. "Which way?" Dave asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I scanned the forest, every direction looking the same, thick, impenetrable, and completely alien. "I don't know," I admitted. "Just away from here. Away from whatever that was." We started walking, our movements slow, cautious. Each step felt like it could trigger something, another whisper, another appearance of that figure lurking just out of sight. My eyes darted to every shadow, every twisted branch, waiting for something to jump out at us. But nothing happened. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and our own labored breathing. After what felt like hours of walking in silence, Dave stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I strained my ears but heard nothing. Just the eerie quiet that had plagued us since we left the cabin. "No," I said, frowning. "What did you hear?" He didn't respond, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze, squinting through the trees. At first, I saw nothing, but then there it was. A light. It flickered faintly, barely visible through the dense trees, but it was unmistakable. A warm, golden glow, like firelight. "Someone's out there," Dave said, his voice filled with sudden hope. "Maybe they can help us." I didn't share his optimism. Something about that light didn't feel right. It was too perfect, too inviting, like a lure set in a trap. Still, we didn't have many options. We were lost in the middle of nowhere, and the thought of running into anyone who wasn't that figure from the night before, seemed like a lifeline. Reluctantly, I nodded, and we started toward the light. As we moved closer, the air grew warmer, but not in a comforting way. It was thick, humid, like we were walking into the mouth of something alive. The trees became more twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching, as if they were trying to grab us. I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead, and the sense of unease settled in my chest like a weight. When we finally reached the source of the light, I wished we hadn't. It wasn't a campsite or another group of hikers. It was something much stranger. In the center of a small clearing stood a stone circle, rough, ancient, and covered in strange symbols like the ones I'd seen carved into the cabin. In the middle of the circle was a fire, burning low but steady. And around the fire, there were figures. 3 of them. They were tall, thin, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They stood completely still, their heads bowed as if in prayer, or maybe something worse. The firelight flickered across their cloaked forms, casting long, grotesque shadows on the ground. "We need to leave," I whispered, grabbing Dave's arm. But he didn't move. His eyes were locked on the figures, his face pale and slack. What are they?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But we shouldn't be here." Before I could pull him away, one of the figures looked up. I felt my blood run cold as I locked eyes with it, if it had eyes. Beneath the hood, I could only make out a shadow, but there was an intelligence in the way it stared at us, something ancient and terrifying. The figure raised one long, bony hand and pointed directly at us. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the air around us, making it hard to think, hard to move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the ground beneath me shift, like the earth itself was trying to pull me down. "Go!" I shouted, yanking Dave out of his trance. "Run!" We bolted, tearing through the forest, the whispers chasing us, growing louder with every step. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Something was behind us. I could feel it, a dark presence, cold and relentless, closing in on us like a shadow creeping over the land. We ran until we could run no more, collapsing in a small hollow beneath a fallen tree. The whispers had stopped again, but the fear hadn't. The forest was still, but it was a predatory stillness, like we were being hunted. What the hell was that? Dave gasped, clutching his side as he struggled to catch his breath. I don't know, I said, my voice shaky. But we can't stay here. We have to keep moving. Moving where? Dave snapped, his panic finally boiling over. We're lost. We've been walking for hours, and everything looks the same. There's no way out of here. There has to be, I insisted, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We need to stay calm. We'll find the trail again. But even as I said the words, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, the certainty that we weren't going to find our way out, that we were being drawn deeper into something we couldn't escape. The air around us grew colder, and I could see my breath puffing out in the dark. The trees groaned softly, like old bones shifting in the night, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced at Dave, and I could tell he felt it too, that same sense of dread that had been growing ever since we'd seen those figures. It was like the forest itself was alive, watching us, waiting for something. We need to move, I whispered, my voice trembling. Now. But before we could stand, the ground beneath us shifted. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the earth began to tremble. The fallen tree we'd been hiding under groaned and split, its rotten wood snapping like bones. The trees around us swayed violently, their branches twisting and writhing like they were alive. Dave scrambled to his feet, his face pale with terror. What the hell is happening? I don't know, I shouted, trying to keep my balance as the ground shook. Just run. We took off again, stumbling through the woods as the forest seemed to collapse around us. The trees bent and twisted, their roots rising from the ground like skeletal hands reaching for us. The air was filled with a deafening roar, like the very earth was screaming. We ran blindly, the shaking ground throwing us off balance at every turn. I could hear Dave yelling behind me, but his voice was drowned out by the noise, the chaos of the forest coming alive around us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The forest was still again, but it was a different kind of stillness, one that was almost expectant. Dave? I called out, my voice hoarse. There was no answer. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, spinning around, searching the darkness. Dave? Where are you? Silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the trees, calling his name over and over, but there was no sign of him. He was gone. And then I saw it. The same light, flickering faintly through the trees, the same one we had followed before. But this time, I knew better. This time, I knew it was a trap. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away, to escape whatever it was that was hunting us. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst out of the trees and into a clearing. The trailhead. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Somehow, by some miracle, I had made it back to where we had started. But Dave wasn't with me. I looked back into the trees, the darkness closing in around me, and I knew whatever had taken him, whatever had lured us into the woods, wasn't done yet. And it wasn't going to let me leave without a price.